Welcome to the Director's Cut of Episode 6. I'm your host, Mick Larson, producer and director of the documentary series, What Would Jesus Do on Election Day? The Director's Cut invites an expert to the podcast and we break down the episode. Our expert is Kelsey. She's a licensed social worker in the Division of Child Welfare. All right, let's get started with Episode 6, Ourselves and Others. The first voice you'll hear is mine, followed by Professor Karina Korostellina. She's a professor and director of the program on prevention of mass violence and the program on history, memory, and conflict at the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. She's also the author of Political Insults: How Offenses Escalate Conflict. When I started working on this documentary 5 years ago, I really wanted to end on a message of hope and a way forward. Luckily, I did find that way forward while making this film. But before we get into the way forward, I want to share two big lessons I learned while working on this project. I'll call this first lesson, what are we doing to ourselves and to others?
Basic idea of social identity theory that in order to achieve our own positive self-esteem, we actually need to compare ourselves with others and put others down. In my work, I speaking about locus of self-esteem. One locus exactly, to achieve what you want to achieve, to build, to develop, and to be proud of who you are. I love this example from Big Fat Greek Wedding movie. Remember how he's telling there are two types of people, Greeks and people who want to be Greek. So this idea that we are much better, everyone just wish they are Greek. It's this idea of internal locus of self-esteem. But it's very hard for many people to achieve this internal locus of self-esteem, so they use external locus of self-esteem. They put down other people and compare. You see, I'm better. I'm better. Look at these people, not educated, or color of skin. It's the most easiest. It's to pick on color of skin or pick on ethnicity or pick on citizenship, which it's easy for people. It's really working for them as an instrument of increasing their feeling of themselves. So prejudice and biases are not something which is basic for a human being. It's a result of our striving to feel more positive about ourselves. But unfortunately, yes, there is a dark side of our opportunity to feel good about ourselves. And what is important, I think, in this is understanding why people need these particular groups, why they don't really feel about themselves, right? If you live in society and you independent, you have your own values, right? You have your own views, you have your own beliefs, you have your own perceptions, and you're completely free to decide, you're free to act, you're free to be independent person. But if something happened to you, if there is some threat in society, who will come and help you? Nobody, right? Because you're not connected, you're individual, you're staying free. So you need you need a group that will help you. So you're looking for the groups, which, again, it can be ethnic, national, gender, regional, whatever, the group which can help you. But why a group will help you? Why actually a group will put their efforts on helping you and supporting you? You have to pay with something for it. And what happening, you pay with loyalty. You become loyal. What doesn't mean to be loyal? You accept values, perceptions, beliefs of this group. And the more you become loyal, the more you're losing your freedom of thoughts. So it's really a dilemma between freedom and security. You get in your security by being more loyal and more affiliated with the group, but at the same time, you're not free anymore. You think like group member. You perceive everything as a group member. You act as a group member. And when we speak about groups, you are not now think about person to person, you think group to group. Usually people try to find secure groups in situation of threat. And what happening, it actually creates this evil, this circle. So then you search for the group which protects you and support you, you become more loyal, so you become thinking more like a group So you see other group as more evil. You're not making your own decision anymore. You think you act as a group member. And that's actually what happened in the United States, a deepening of this divide between people, because people are not acting anymore as just independent individuals with their views. They act as members of their group with liberal perception, more conservative perception. This is how they define themselves, because they feel threat to their value system. You don't have to have threat only for your life.
I think that's interesting. We stop being an individual and we think as a group. We interact from group to group. What do you think about that?
I think in the context of what she's talking about, right, specifically for people that don't have that internal sense of self-esteem or self-worth or self-value, and they are reliant on essentially the external validation of other people's or their group. I think for that population, or those type of people that are so heavily reliant on their self of identity and sense of self-worth for an outside group, I think that somebody that is in that position is probably more likely to fall into groupthink and to fall into just going with the norms or the expectations or the values of the group that they are identifying with, because they don't have their own internal sense of self-esteem to be able to think more independently, like she's talking about. And so, right, when you are in that space, when you are reliant on an outside group to have that internal or to have that external validation for your own self-worth and self-esteem, if you challenge that thinking of the group in any way, you're at risk of losing your self-worth and your self-esteem because you don't have that internally.
Yeah, there's a story of the 9/11 truthers or hoaxers or whatever they are, that 9/11 didn't happen, and someone took a member of that group to 9/11, showed them exactly what happened, and so he goes back to the group and said he's changed his mind, and they attacked him online. They tried to just ruin his life because he
dissented from the group ideologies.
Yes.
And I think not only do you have that more emotional threat, but there are also some groups that if you disagree and you go, against the grain, so to speak, that physical safety can become an issue as well. And so human beings, right, we do a lot of self-preservation to keep ourselves physically and emotionally safe. And so that's not surprising when you have a group and especially a group that is very locked into what their group is, and there's very little room or very little tolerance for kind of independent thinking. The more at risk a person is when they start to think independently, much like you described, right? And I think, and especially we kind of are living in a unique environment right now where there is so much, like everyone has access to the internet, you know what I mean? Everybody has access to these types of things, and it's incredibly easy, I think now more than ever, for somebody's reputation to be absolutely tanked or ruined as a result of a group kind of turning on them. And I think that a lot of times, right, especially when you have that kind of groupthink, you don't even have people that are willing to.
The cost is too high to be paid.
Yeah.
To go, hey, have you guys thought about this?
Right, or to even, when somebody has kind of become an enemy of their former group, even people being able to step in and be like, hey, we used to have a connection to this person, like maybe we don't need to do that, because then right there they can very quickly be viewed as an ally to the person who has ultimately spoken out against the group and put themselves at risk as well. So it can create a vicious and kind of scary cycle of, oh, I don't want that to happen to me, so I better fall in line. So I think it's multi-leveled too. Like I don't think it's all just based on self-esteem and self-worth, but I definitely think that people who don't have that internal sense are more likely to fall into these groups that they're not able to think independently for, and can at a certain point start to become dangerous for them to do so.
And right now we have it's August of 2024. We have a great example of this, and that is the governor of Georgia, who would not cheat for Donald Trump, immediately became an enemy of Donald Trump. even though they're in the same group. And Governor Kemp is a very, very conservative Republican, and obviously a patriot because he's not going against the Constitution. But so Trump's been attacking him nonstop recently, and so there's your perfect example.
Well, I think there's so many examples of people that were once allies of Trump or supporters of Trump who have obviously in recent years been like, we can no longer stand and support this person.
Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are perfect examples.
Right, there are so many, right? And then you look at how Trump's, for lack of a better word, fan base respond to that, right? Very hateful, because they do view these people then as enemies to Donald Trump, as opposed to, people.
Yeah, a fellow citizen who happens to disagree with you, maybe.
Right, absolutely.
In Brian Kemp's position, agrees with you 98 out of 100 things.
Right, but because you have spoken out against Donald Trump, you are an enemy, right? Perfect examples, and I think we're seeing a whole lot of that with people who have formally been in alignment with Trump, who are, for whatever reason, I think they're pretty obvious reasons, but are speaking out against him, or even trying to just give some different perspectives on how the Republican Party maybe can do some things differently and probably better, but because it's not necessarily in alignment with Trump's views or policies, people are turning on those people.
Next up is Paula Ioannidis, Associate Professor at the Center for Study of Culture, Race, and Ethnicity at Ithaca College. She's also the author of Emotional Politics of Racism: How Feelings Trump Facts in an Era of Colorblindness.
I always ask myself, why isn't there the political will to even do what's economically in our own interest? And the only answer I can come up with is that we bought into this narrative, this myth of we're better than these other people, so much so that the psychological sort of little rewards we get for that almost sort of trump our own economic interests to some degree, because since you could even argue that at this point, neoliberalism and this kind of global economy is in this multinational corporation takeover is actually now, really shrinking the wealth of even the white middle class and certainly the white working class, right? I mean, we've been reading about it. So it used to be that there was a kind of correlation between the policies and this kind of white middle class and white advantage, but that's actually increasingly not true. And so it begs the question of why do even white Americans sort of act against their own economic interests, right? And certainly people on the conservative right. And for some people, it's about these social issues like abortion and, these kinds of beliefs that are very dear to who people are. But in other cases, I'm not sure if it's a matter of political ignorance of how things actually work, or if there's actually a kind of pleasure principle, right, in sort of denigrating these very scapegoats and still continuing to gain this idea that, you're gonna be the exception and you're gonna make it somehow,
What about that idea that someone's identity is wrapped up in a political or social movement? We've kind of touched on that, but
Yeah, I definitely think that we see that, right? People fall into those categories where they have been able to identify themselves with a group or a cause. And again, I think it can, so let's use the example of people who are pro-life, or on the flip side even of that, right, pro-choice, and have identified themselves so strongly with that they see it as part of their identity. It makes the risk of losing those things from either perspective even more threatening, right? Because it is no longer a cause or a movement. It is a part of your identity, right? And having part of your identity being challenged or being at risk of no longer existing, again, can be very, very scary for the human brain, right? Again, it comes back to that self-preservation and that emotional safety that our bodies and our brains are always trying to do for ourselves. And if we are at risk of losing something that is who we are, it can up the ante, right? It can make it so that people will, for some people, and in some cases will do whatever it takes to ensure that they do not lose that cause or that thing, because it is who they identify themselves as being.
And it can get violent as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, I mean, there's been many abortion doctors that have been killed.
Yes.
The last one I know of was in Wichita, Kansas, and they walked into his church on a Sunday morning and shot him point blank.
Right.
And, you know, abortion clinics in the thousands have been vandalized, and, you know, bomb threats, and, you know, all the people protesting outside. You know, it's just kind of insane.
Right. That's what I meant when I said, you know, people will do whatever it takes to protect their cause, because in a sense they're protecting themselves. And I think that we see it so much so with, I think, exceptional violence with abortion and abortion rights, because there are certain groups who also perceive it as having an impact to, you know, our most vulnerable populations, which are children. And so they feel not only are they protecting a piece of themselves, but they are also protecting that vulnerable population, without really though.
Well, you say that, and what jumps in my head is I've been to pro-life protests outside of abortion clinics before, and I've interviewed them.
Right.
And, you know, ask them, you know, why are you here? And they'll give you your standard answer about the fetus and stuff. So I say, so you're totally probably then great with, you know, free school lunches and, you know, prenatal care free, and, you know, all the things that would help the child,
Right.
baby, infant once it's born. And they're like, well, I don't know about that, but
Right.
it's about, and you go, well, what do you mean? Because well, it's about the fetus.
Right. Right. Well, and that's, I mean, as a social worker, that's the realm I primarily work in, right? Children and families. And the amount of resources that so many families could benefit from, and benefit from having prenatal, you know, prenatal, postnatal, not only for the mother, but for those children, like you said, right? Free school lunches, children having access to developmental services, social emotional services. I live in a very rural community. Even pediatrician services can be pretty limited. And it gets even more so for children who are living in poverty. And additionally, right, we live in a community that has a foster care crisis, right? I think across the nation, there's a shortage of foster homes. There's a shortage of services that can help families be healthy and have children be safe and healthy in their homes. But yet these people who are speaking pro-life aren't showing up in the swarms to help and provide those services, to give these people and these children specifically the healthiest lives that they can have, or to support them as their family heals and recovers from the traumas that they have experienced in their life that have led to the situations that they're in. But yet they're showing up, right? They're showing up in swarms to try
and voting.
And voting to try to restrict a person's right to terminate a pregnancy if they choose to do that.
Or if they need to.
Or if they need to do that. Or, you know, it's not about the reason behind why. That should be a right that people who have children should be able to access.
I've always thought the energy and money that's gone into the pro-life movement, if you took all that money and energy and put it into helping children.
Like a child-specific public program, absolutely.
I mean, it'd be
absolutely.
It would be insane.
It would be.
It'd be so awesome.
Yeah, it would be so awesome, and it would lead to better outcomes for the population that they're claiming they're advocating for, but their actions are not aligning with that advocacy. Right, they're a big mouthpiece, but the actions are not aligning, and we see that time and time again when different policies are presented to support children and to support families, and they're voted against time and time again. And the people who are most impacted by that are children, and some of those policies that we're we're kind of talking about and thinking about in relation to what I consider to be, more pro-life than just showing up and saying babies should be born.
Yeah, there's more than one way to be pro-life, that's for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, we are back with Professor Karina Korostelina.
I always like to go and bring some historic examples to understand what's going on right now. It's always it's bringing us a little bit out of current emotions of current situation and understanding something which more distant to us. And for me, one of the best examples to understand what actually happening right now in the United States is example of Little Rock, Arkansas. Then it's already history, some people know better about it. What actually happened there is that the federal law required desegregation of communities. Little Rock, Arkansas had to choose several schools to become desegregated schools. Little Rock, Arkansas had three major communities. Rich whites who had complete control of the city, blue-collar whites, poor, and African American community. This the blue-collar whites, poor whites, they didn't have control of the city at all. They didn't have money. They live in very poor environment, very poor communities. But at the same time, they were feeling they are better than these African Americans. It gives them self-esteem. They were feeling better. They feel like they own the city. Then city council come together and decided what we are actually doing about this desegregation. They had to choose several schools. Of course, it's not a surprise. Then they choose schools which were placed in white, poor regions. They didn't choose any school which was in a rich school. So what happened for this white people, they're now knowing that social boundary change. If before it was before whites and African American, now it's between poor and rich. They will protest and they will become so aggressive. They become mobs. They will throwing stones into children, African American children going to schools. So they actually had to call the National Reserve and police to support every single child going into schools. So much negativity toward this because they feel threat to their identity. They feel threat to their sources of self-esteem. If you look into the small case of the small Little Rock and try to apply it for the entire to United States, you will see a very similar pattern.
What do you think about her Arkansas example and extrapolating that to the whole country as far as, white resentment and backlash that we see from a certain type of white American?
I think her really talking about this social boundary changing is really, really interesting, right? Because in the example that she provides, the blue-collar white population of that community were viewing themselves as better than the black community, and so
it gave them the external
which is
external validation,
right, and for them to be able to kind of separate themselves from that group, and by saying, well, we may be blue collar, but we're not that group, right?
I think that's where white privilege comes from.
Yeah, I mean, definitely has some roots, right?
Yeah.
And then I think when you shift that boundary for people who have that much hatred in their heart and their minds, it can be incredibly dangerous for the other group that is kind of being looked down upon or
has
hated.
been demonized.
Yeah, has been demonized by that group, and we saw that play out with the desegregation of the Little Rock, Arkansas school district, right? And the violence that played out. And I definitely think that it's something that we still continue to see today.
The groups change.
Right.
I mean, right now you're seeing so much anti-trans hate, and I find it unbelievable that there'd be any hate against the most vulnerable group probably there is.
But that's historically how our country has played out. That hierarchy of of or systematic racism within our community or within our country, right? Which has then created this idea that we can't have, both people can't have the same thing, right? Which is why you see such an increase in hate crimes and hate rhetoric when you're talking about rights for minority or ostracized groups, right? LGBTQ marriages, right? Those crimes skyrocket when we're talking about making, gay marriage legalized, right? Giving people the same opportunities that have been afforded to a predominantly white population throughout the history of this country. That group can feel very threatened when other groups that historically have been demonized begin to start to have the same rights and the same opportunities. And that's not for, not all white people have that same perspective, but there is definitely a group that exists that for whatever reason cannot seem to understand that just because you have something doesn't mean that I can't also have it, right?
And that you don't lose anything.
And that you don't lose it.
It's not a piece of pie.
Right, but it can start to threaten their space in society when other groups are starting to be given the same opportunities, which is so sad to even say that in 2024 we're even having this conversation about other groups being afforded the same basic rights that have been offered to one population of this country from day one.
Or letting someone be their authentic self when it has zero effect on you.
Right. Zero effect, right? What my neighbor across the street, what their marriage looks like and means to them has no impact on me, right? As long as they're not screaming and yelling across the street, right? But that's a completely different issue in and of itself. But a lot of those different things have no impact on other people. And it, again, just levels the playing field, and people take some of that for such granted, like something as simple as a marriage and being able to authentically be in love and be who you want to be with, and be able to go and enjoy the simple pleasures of holding your partner's hand while walking down the street because you're married to them and you love this person, is not afforded to everybody in this country. And it can feel very threatening, I think, for certain groups when that starts to equal out. And again, to protect their own privilege. And again, this is not to say every person thinks this way, but there is a very specific group that will act on that.
Well, and that's kind of like, Make America Great Again. It's like, well, it was great for some people, not so great for other people. And actually, in 2024, it's the best version of America that we have so far, because, I was in Key West and other places where you see gay couples walking around holding hands, and I found that so wonderful that now we live in a country where that is permissible. No one bats an eye. Nobody. Some people probably do, but it's just nice that they feel comfortable and safe enough to do that.
Right.
Where 20 years ago that would not be possible. So,
but I also think it's certain areas, right? Certain areas are more accepting and more understanding. But the fact that there are certain areas that are okay, no one bats an eye when a man and a woman were walking down the street holding hands anywhere in the country. But there are definitely still areas of this country that if a woman and a woman are walking down the street holding hands, or a man and a man, there is a chance that they will be killed, still to this day.
Sure.
And I think that speaks to the inequality of marriage specifically. But there are a lot of different examples, right? I mean, there are a lot of areas where it's not safe for women in this country to be walking alone, or to be, there's just a lot of those different dynamics that still exist. And there are still groups that benefit from those inequalities.
We again hear from Associate Professor Paula Ioannidis.
A deep sense of self-worth cannot be given by someone else, right? You have to actually create it yourself. It has to come through a kind of self-creation process. And it cannot depend on other people's affirmation or denial of who you are. And whenever you witness somebody who has that deep sense of confidence and self-worth that isn't dependent on somebody else's denigration, you see a kind of spiritual peace. And because they're no longer sort of dependent on gaining their sense of superiority through someone else. It's sort of a self-referential process, or maybe it's in relation to their own principles of what they think they're here to do, right? And what I think it creates at a widespread level is a kind of spiritual depravity, right? Because to denigrate someone else constantly actually distances yourself from them. It necessarily has to do so, right? But we often, I think, don't consider the fact that whenever you put someone else down, you're actually also deadening your own experience, because you're investing in a form of disconnection constantly. And whenever you're disconnected from other people, the way that we're disconnected from the earth right now and its resources, and we feel like we could just exploit it ad nauseum and not have any repercussions, right? When you're that disconnected from, the earth and other people, you're also disconnected from yourself. And when you're disconnected from yourself, there's a price to be paid there, I think, in terms of having to constantly fill yourself with a kind of, with all of these external forms of value. I have a nice car. I'm superior to this group of people. I'm, women competing with each other, all kinds of, beauty and all this kind of stuff. And that's, I think, a mass structure that's rooted in what we've been habituated in learning from racism, from sexism, from homophobia, from all of these forms of denigration and oppression, right? And I don't think people think about that price to the advantaged, that you've actually become a deeply alienated, spiritually disconnected person from other people and from yourself, that you almost cannot feel deeply, right? To understand that your life is linked with the fate of others. And I'm kind of working on thinking about that price, right? Because we often don't see it, and yet we see its reverberations in today's society. I mean, these mass shootings, these constant forms of everyday violence, right? I think that they're symptoms of this spiritual depravity, right? Of not understanding how we're linked to one another and not understanding how to honor one another as a result of that.
What about the idea that Paula talks about here, that the price certain people pay for being disconnected from others and not understanding that we're all linked?
So I think she makes a really good point in that when we're doing that, we are separating ourselves from really the ability to learn and the ability to connect and the ability to have empathy for other groups and for the people that we're interacting with in the world around us, or in people's cases that are demonizing and villainizing those groups. They're not interacting, but they're trading off, right, that hate for the ability to have connection and love and empathy and kindness, which has the potential to bring communities together, to be healthier, right? When people are connected, there's better outcomes for everybody involved. She makes a really good point, right, that we are seeing a continued rise in violence in our communities and in our country.
By white men that are very disconnected from everything.
Right, very disconnected. And when you spend your time in a bubble with either your own independent think that is filled with that level of separation and disconnection, it gets dangerous, even more dangerous, when we have rhetoric that exists in this country now that those types of thoughts and behaviors are okay. Right, gun violence specifically in this country, although nobody is saying it's okay, our government is not doing anything to change that or to regulate that, and in a roundabout way is saying it is, which is a pretty hot take maybe, but
no, I think you're right. There's a whole political party that's like not allowing
not allowing
the government to take the steps necessary to protect ourselves and protect the children in schools.
Right, or even and even obviously children in schools, right, which speaks to our whole pro-life conversation earlier, right? Like,
right.
We're not making any steps to protect the children that are Earth side. And so these things continue to happen time and time again in our country with very minimal to no changes, which just further, I think, in a lot of ways separates people.
Next, we hear from me again, setting up the next section of this episode. Then we'll hear from Dr. James Sacita, director of the Multicultural Center at Cal State Long Beach. The other lesson I learned while making this documentary would seem rather obvious, but it's not really something we think about, and it's extremely important to our history and to our future. And that is the lesson of the victors write the history.
The grand narrative, which again is a cover-up for reality. You're not going to be told, well, the United States was built upon slavery and genocide. Its wealth was from enslaving human beings, of which we've never acknowledged nor apologized for. And the genocide against the indigenous people are not even on the radar of conversation. So whatever grand outcomes you think the country had was on the backs of enslaved human beings, or on the elimination of 500 nations that preceded European contact. So again, we have cultural amnesia, historic amnesia. We have no idea of cultural history.
What do you think about James' point about us having cultural and historical amnesia as a society, as a culture?
Well, I think in order to have amnesia, you have to be able to have the knowledge to actually forget it, right? I think that for being a country that's built on immigration and has so much diversity and so much culture, we really do ourselves a disservice by not talking about all of those groups that exist in our country. It's not taught.
Yeah, there should be like a class in middle school or high school that's just about immigration.
Yeah, right.
Like the history of immigration in America.
Right, because that's one of the things that makes America so beautiful is the diversity and is the culture, and is that so many people have come from all over the world to live here to make it this that term that they use, the melting pot. Yet we're not having conversations about our history as a country. And the information that we are teaching, especially in public schools, is very limited.
Or white-centric.
Yeah, yes. And can be very isolating or exclusionary for all of the other groups that live in this country. How awesome would it be for a Mexican-American child such as myself to be able to go to school and learn about my culture's history in this country, and to have my friends learn about my culture's history in this country, and not feel like it's something that, families are solely reliant to teach, assuming that families are willing and able to do that. And I just think that it could really increase, again, that connection and that empathy and that understanding, because when we understand, we're a lot less fearful, right? We are a lot more empathetic. We're a lot more connected because we have things that we understand about the other person, right? Or that we're able to, especially for a group that maybe we don't understand or we don't identify with, but we're able to be educated to be able to connect with one another. And there's very limited education on other cultures in this country, unless it's something that you're seeking out. There's this idea in social work of cultural competence. And what that means is that, you are never going to be able to understand fully a culture that you don't identify with, but you can take steps to understand in a means to connect to a person and to be able to work with them in a way that's culturally in alignment with their cultural values.
And have respect for those values.
And have respect for those values for better outcomes for people. Because one size does not fit all. And culture has such deep roots for people and is such a huge part of a person's identity. And being able to work with people in a way that's culturally appropriate leads to better outcomes, right? Because you are working with them in a world that aligns with who they are as a person and is respectful of their backgrounds, which seems so obvious, right? But I think the fact that we have, social work in the mental health world, there is conversation about culture. There is conversation about how do we apply this into the work that we're doing with people every single day. Speaks to the positive shifts in that education, in that ideology of how important culture is for people and the impact that it makes on their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I just think, there's been a movement the last few years of kind of a second whitewash of American history and not telling the real history of America. But if anything needs to happen, it needs to be the factual, accurate history of America needs to be taught to the children to understand where we came from, all the aspects of good and bad. And, then you have just a better understanding of how we got to the place that we're at if you actually have the real facts and the real history.
And I think that there's a lot of fear in being honest, but obviously there's a way to teach accurate history in a way that's age appropriate. And I think the other thing too is just because our history has some very, very dark and horrific periods doesn't take away from all of the good things that have happened in our country and may have even been happening during those times. Like, it can be both. Horrible things could have been happening at the same time that some really great things were happening. But we do ourselves a disservice by saying, right,
It was all great.
It was all great. It was all great. Because it also minimizes the traumas that are still presenting themselves generationally for a lot of groups that experience some really awful things in this country.
Well, the other thing, that's not how life works at an individual level,
Right.
at a group level, at a
Right.
cultural level, at a societal level. Like nothing.
Nothing is sunshine and rainbows all the
No,
time.
it
Bad
just-
things happen.
Yeah. So it's like it's just so unrealistic and the way we were taught. That's for sure.
No, I agree. I think it was very, looking at my own, public education history, it's very limited, but what you're taught in history classes and how you're taught it,
Yeah, it does make a difference.
it really does.
All right, we are back with Paula.
And one would think that we are deeply invested in sort of a questioning process, a critical thinking process to examine the false beliefs we may have been handed down either by our parents or our families or our educational system, which largely relies on a set of myths rather than actual factual history, But what, for me, the political moment begs the question of, are we going to shape some political myths or, some narratives that are actually closer to the truth, that actually appeal to people, but on other grounds than this kind of the pleasure that people gain from sort of scapegoating someone else?
I think the point that I like that Paula's making is like, if you don't teach the real history, then you're scapegoating other people.
Absolutely.
Do you know the history of Christopher Columbus at all?
Yeah, of course I know the history of
Well,
Christopher
what's your
Columbus.
version of that?
Like the version I was taught?
Yeah,
Or
the version.
the version I was taught or the version that I have since educated
the
myself
version
on?
you were taught. Then tell me. The other.
So the version that I was taught, right, was that Christopher Columbus came over on the Mayflower with the 3 ships, right? The Mayflower, the Santa Maria, and
The Nina?
the Nina. Yes, I couldn't remember, which is also, right, the irony of that in and of itself, right? Anyway, he comes over, lands on Plymouth Rock with the Pilgrims, and discovered America. That is the version of Christopher Columbus that I was taught. I remember, for some reason, such a heavy influence on Thanksgiving as well. And I remember, this is so terrible, I remember we would have at least one year, but I feel like it was multiple years because it's pretty vivid in my memory, in elementary school where we would have, like on Columbus Day, right, we would have a big feast type of thing, and you had the option to be a pilgrim, or back then, right, they still use the terminology Indian, but, you know, Native American. And, right, if you were a pilgrim, you would make your little pilgrim hat and you would wear the little outfit. And then if you chose to be a Native American, you would build a little feather headdress out of construction paper, and we would have lunch. Like, that
Have a
is
feast.
Yeah, we would have a feast to celebrate Christopher Columbus and the fact that he discovered America, and this peaceful invitation that he had made to the Native American people to have this shared feast. So
Wow, there's nothing true in anything that you said.
right.
So what do you know about Christopher Columbus now? Post high school.
I think when I was in high school was really the first time actually that I had a history teacher challenge that idea, right? That was really like, Christopher Columbus did not discover America. So luckily, by the time I had made it to high school, the education had shifted a little bit. I think it was a lot more honest about the fact that Christopher Columbus did not discover America, obviously.
He never set foot on North America.
Right, and that the things that he did to the native people that were living on this land when he got here were horrific.
On the islands, yeah,
right,
in the Caribbean.
Right, he was doing some pretty awful and horrific
Yeah,
things.
he went to prison for it.
Right, like, like
They didn't teach us that part.
Right, I didn't even know that part.
Of
Like
course
that's right, but that whole idea is completely false. But I think even the fact that we have changed Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, I think speaks to the
Awareness,
word,
yeah.
the awareness and kind of forward shift in that honesty about our history, even though it's not what all of us were taught. That honest, being a little bit more honest about that, I think it is showing in things as simple as that.
So two things. I believe when I took a dive into Christopher Columbus, I believe the reason why that whole narrative started was because Italians, Spanish, Southern Europeans were being so persecuted here in America that they came up with this concept and to celebrate Christopher Columbus to give them like a break, like, hey, this is something to be proud of. He discovered America. Like, there's, you know, this is a good thing, right? I think, if I remember right, that was the motivation.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and the other thing is about the Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah.
The Indians, natives, were not invited.
Right.
They were not invited. The only reason they went and saw us because the whites were drunk and were firing off their pistols and stuff, and so the natives thought they were being attacked, so they came to their rescue, and then they find out they were just drank too much. I believe that
Nothing
to be the
more
case.
American.
I hate to be. I hope I'm not spreading misinformation, but
You're out here just
I believe that was the real history of that. So we should be celebrating beer, I guess. On
First of
Thanksgiving.
all, this country loves beer. They love their alcohol, and they love their guns. So that's what I'm saying. Nothing more American.
That is true.
Than that.
And we love not inviting indigenous people.
Right. Right.
Next up is Daryl Wing Su, professor of psychology and education at Teachers College, Columbia University. He's also the author of Race, Talk, and the Conspiracy of Silence.
The group that owns history, the group that is able to define reality, is a group that has power. When you tell a Native American that Columbus discovered America, and when teachers test students as to their knowledge and ask a question, true, false, Columbus discovered America, and all the white students say that's Mickey Mouse and that it's true, but Native Americans say, that it isn't true, they get an incorrect score and are told that there is something wrong in their intelligence or knowledge of history. This is what I call cultural oppression, where the reality of one group And that's oftentimes related to whiteness as well. This is something that we were referring to, that whiteness is an invisible standard that is enforced on individuals. And because whiteness is a background, white Western ways, it is invisible to people who are white Americans, but it's not invisible to people of color. It's like a fish that is in a bowl of water swimming, doesn't see the water until they're out of it. Yet the water represents something toxic and unhealthy to people of color. And this is where we get the clash of racial realities. Now, you may ask, whose racial reality is the correct reality? I mean, that's what I get all the time. And luckily, there is social psychological studies that answer that question. What they find is that on matters of bias, the group that is most disempowered has the most accurate perception of reality. And this is not something innate to people, but I can just simply ask you the question, if you're a white woman working in corporate America that is dominated by white men, for you, a white woman, to do well, you have to really understand the thinking of your white male counterparts and the rules and regulations or policies and procedures of a Western white corporate world in order to do well. White men don't need to understand the thinking of white women to do well. And the same analogy applies to people of color. If I enter into an organization, a corporation that is primarily white in orientation, I need to really understand the thinking of white colleagues and white Western ways to do well, but they don't have to understand me as an Asian American. The other thing I frequently ask people is this, that if you really want to understand sexism, do you ask men or women? If you want to understand heterosexism, do you ask straights or gay? And likewise, if you want to understand racism, do you ask whites or people of color? The answer to me is obvious. And I see oftentimes in Congress where they'll be talking about things dealing with a women's right to health. And all the panelists are white men who are sitting there making the decisions. They really don't have the ability to empathize or understand completely the worldview of people who differ from them.
What about this point that he makes so well, that whiteness is the backdrop, whiteness is the water that we all swim in the United States?
I love him. I love everything that he says, and as a Mexican American woman, that like a lot of what he says resonates with me. I have other friends in the community that I live in that are people of color, and we live in a predominantly white conservative community, and we've had conversations amongst ourselves about, because we were raised in that community and all of our parents, tried to fit us into those molds. There's almost this kind of cultural identity struggle where we're not brown enough to fit in with our brown or people of color, our
your own culture,
our own cultures, but also no matter how much we act and we fit into that mold of whiteness, we're also still always, we will never be white. We will never be white enough. And so, and that's something that unless you are a person of color, you can't understand that, right? Because we live in a culture that is, in a country that is built around whiteness. I think he explains it so eloquently and so perfectly that, I mean, truthfully, there's not really much else I can add to what he has said but it resonates so much with me, and it is so accurate, right when he says, when you're talking about sexism, you're going to ask the women, right? When you're talking about racism, you're going to ask the people of color. But yet we have people that are making laws in our country every single day for minority groups that don't look like us, right? They don't speak like us. They don't understand, nor can they, and that's no fault of their own, right? They can't help that they were born white men.
They can't help they won the lottery.
Right? Like but we are a country that is built off of for the people, by the people, but yet the people don't look like the people. You know what I mean? The people in power don't look like the people that
diversity
live
of them, yeah.
that live in this country, right? Like I was saying before, we are such a diverse and such a cultural rich country, and that is not reflected at all in the people that are making the most crucial decisions in this country on behalf of those people. And I think that is, at least for the friends that I have and myself that are people of color, that's so frustrating about what happens with laws. Is it's like, how can you speak to these experiences of other people, and how can you make decisions for other people without any sort of understanding or attempted understanding of what that's like, right? It's very rare that you see politicians or people in power asking, right? Ask people what they want. And it gets really, really discouraging when people rally together and they do vote, right? And we do try to advocate, and it a lot of times feels like it falls on deaf ears.
Well, America is a total, 2 steps forward, 1 steps back country, and it's probably no different than, it's just a human thing. But, I mean, and someone says this in this documentary, I forget which episode, but, it's in this episode right here, number 6, that America's had white Americans have had affirmative action for 400 years. And, obviously in the 70s, we started to have affirmative action for people of color because they've been discriminated against for so long at so many different levels and systemically. But yet people can't even, white Americans, or a group of white Americans, Republicans to be specific, can't deal with DEI or the fact that you want to try to help the people that you've put down.
Right.
And open up the doors and give them the opportunity that you have taken away from them for hundreds of years.
Right.
And then you have 30 or 40 years of affirmative action, and now I think the Supreme Court overruled, at least at the university level, that you can have preferences. So it's just, that's the story of America right there.
Well, and I think to one, add a little bit of hope, but also to speak to the education piece that we were talking about earlier about the lack of education for cultures and minority groups. With kind of the, I think, more honest and realistic descriptions that are happening in public education, right? And I know, like, even when I was in elementary school, right, we were taught, I think, probably, okay, let me pause for a second. My brain was moving too fast. Like, when I was in elementary school, right, the civil rights movement, I remember being a huge topic, right? And it was talked about every single year. And I think with each consecutive year, it got more and more real. I mean, we were taught about segregation. We were taught about lynchings. We were taught about the horrible, horrible things that happened to Black people in this country. And I think that by teaching that and showing all of the change like this country did do, and again, we're not perfect and we still have a lot of work to do, but I think it gives hope that we were able to overcome something so horrific and so awful that Black people experience in this country. And again, racism is still alive and well. I don't want to minimize that.
For sure.
But I do think it gives hope that we were able to overcome such segregation and such horrific things that Black people experience in this country. So it does give hope, right? It does give a sense of hope that if we continue to educate and we continue to do those things, that we can continue to make forward progress, right? And we can continue to make it a more equitable and more equal country for everybody that lives here.
And that's why Make America Great Again is total propaganda.
100%.
Because the latest version, 2020-24, I contend is the best version of America.
Right, as frustrating as it is, and as much as we want to be farther along than we are, I think it's incredibly frustrating too, because there was such a significant setback, I think, when Trump became president. And I think a lot of people that wouldn't have been so outwardly racist and homophobic and transphobic and misogynistic have found a platform and a safe space to exist.
A permission structure
he gave
to do
that permission. And so I think that it really validated a lot of people who maybe wouldn't, like there are always going to be groups that are outwardly those things and not see anything wrong with that. But I think that it gave permission to people that previously would not have been so outwardly those types of things, and so hateful, the permission to do that and the platform to do that, right? Not only were they given permission, but they were given spaces to hold those values and beliefs and to be reaffirmed by other people. I think that's the other thing that's so dangerous, right? Is that it's one thing to hold really nasty and horrible beliefs. It's another thing to be
in community.
In a community, right, exactly. In a community that really encourages that type of thinking and encourages that type of hatred and violence and nastiness. So I think in a lot of ways it does feel like steps back, which I think is even more frustrating. But hopefully in this next presidential election, we'll have a shift and things will
start moving forward again.
Unfortunately, I think that it's going to take a lot of time to undo all of what Trump did in terms of that kind of social and emotional propaganda, so to speak. But it is hopeful that in the past we have been much worse and we were able to persevere and educate and overcome and are, I think, in a better space to have honest conversations about what minority groups are still experiencing in terms of racism and prejudice and discrimination. And I think that there are more spaces and more people who are willing to have those conversations now. And the first thing to change is to identify a problem, right? And I think having groups that are willing to talk about that and have those hard conversations with people is good. And there's no way that we can do that without educating ourselves and educating each other.
Let me ask you this question. I brought this up in episode 5, The Answer, but for a moment, pretend you're Republican, and then I ask you this question. How do you feel about voting with the Ku Klux Klan? How do you feel about voting with, white nationalists? How do you feel about voting? You're in the same voting block of all these awful people, all these awful ideologies. Why would you do such a thing?
Well, I think that level, I think that's kind of a dangerous question, because I think that there are a lot of people who vote Republican who do not align with those groups. Like I said, I live in
I agree. But the thought that I'm voting with these people.
Right, like I'm voting in it, but I think it's much more complex than that. I think it's much, much more complex than that, because I think that there are a lot of Republicans who are very, very outspoken for, being anti-racist, you know what I mean? And, and I think especially now, more than ever, you're finding Republican figures that are willing to show up to the table and say, hey, this is not okay.
Yeah, this is not acceptable.
This is unacceptable, and this is a huge setback for this country, and we cannot go back there. You know what I mean? I think that we, now more than ever, have those Republican politicians that are willing to take that stance. And again, kind of like I was speaking about before, willing to speak out against Trump and speak out against the rhetoric that he's spewing and saying, whoa, 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 this is not okay.
Of course, they've been tossed out of, Trumpistan.
Right, they have, but I think being able to take that stance is incredibly, incredibly important, especially now. So I think it's more complex than just you're voting with people in the the KKK, because I think there are a lot of people who are actively against that and do a lot of of good work to try to educate people. And
So I'm hearing you say I'm being a little harsh.
you're being a little harsh, right? Because at the
I
end of the
hear you.
day, at the end of the day, too, like, right, like, by ostracizing even Republicans is doing exactly what we've been talking about this entire time, right?
Yeah.
It's creating distance, and especially in a time where there is so much divide and there is so much hate for the other side, politically speaking, when really what people need to do is to find that middle ground so we can get out of this really like social and cultural space that we are in, because this is not benefiting anybody.
True.
It is not benefiting the left. It is not benefiting the right. It is not definitely not benefiting anybody that's in the middle, right? And so how do we find that middle ground so that we can go forward? Because I think the majority recognizes, regardless of which political way that you lean, that this America that we're in right now is not where we want to stay.
Yeah, everybody's exhausted.
Right.
in that.
We are, as a country, we are tired, and it plays out, and I think we see it, right, in the absolute, like, our mental health fields are stretched thin, right? Like, now more than ever, like, we are seeing mental health crisis. We are seeing substance use through the roof, right? People every single day, we have more and more houseless. We have more and more sick. We have more and more people dying by violence, right? We are a country that is rampant with domestic violence, substance use, violence, and people are tired, right? People are tired, and more than ever, people are isolated. And all of those things that I've just described get worse with isolation.
True.
And we are not going to overcome them as a country if we continue to further divide ourselves. Like, we have to find common ground so that we can move forward and heal as a country.
Well said.
Thank you.
Next, we hear from Shelley Tucklock, professor in the education department at Mount St. Mary's University. She's also the author of Witnessing Whiteness: The Need to Talk About Race and How to Do It.
It was a really difficult thing in my 20s to start to reconcile the fact that I had been raised with an ideology that was beautiful and uplifting, and I thought brought people together. And what I was hearing from so many people around me is that was not the reality of the history as they understood it. And here's where I think a lot of us struggle. How to have both and live together. It is not either everything was glorious and wonderful or everything was 100% horrible and awful and we have to reject everything. And that process sometimes involves us living in either world for a while. That's what happened to me. I had grown up within the patriotic frame, and then I shifted to one where I would be just like so many hardcore activists, just not able to even mention the Founding Fathers' names without a sneer. Could not imagine the possibility of valuing anything that had come during the time period where slavery was enacted. Nothing could be redeemed. And over time, I've had to find this place of balance, of understanding, yes, people are people of their time, and there is horror within that. And that is a hard place to rest. But I don't think enough of us are willing to even imagine that. And I think part of the reason why, at least what I experienced, was when I was asked to see myself associated with a history that has so much trauma and violence and oppression linked to it, it felt like my entire worldview had to change. And let's not be unclear about what a difficult thing that is for a lot of people. For someone to accept what today is being offered as the need for diversity, equity, inclusion, for many people is a complete and radical change of mind frame about all of what they've known. And to accept and go down that path, that particular framing, which is something that I now fully accept, admittedly, also puts people into jeopardy in their own friendship and family relationships. Because it means that to accept and go down this path might mean arguments, might mean rejection from those that they love. And so there's, I think, a lot of understandable fear around what it means to adopt a completely different worldview. I still think it's worth the effort. I think my experience with my own family is a good model even for me about the fact that we can educate one another. We can recover from that amnesia that we've had in terms of ignoring so much of our history. But it does take work. My capacity to engage with people across race had been undermined, because if all I know is, oh yeah, racism happened way back then and it's 3 pages worth of my textbook, then I don't have any sense of the depth of trauma and what happened since then. Whereas now that I've taken it up as an exploration and a personal mission to learn more about it, I'm just as infuriated as many people who are out there protesting, because what I understand is that I was not given the tools to be able to engage well. I wasn't given the tools to be able to understand how our current systems and current policies are actually acting out of some old assumptions, some old mythology, and some of the old manipulative cons that we were subjected to that actually prompted us to buy in to a system that was unjust at its core and has never gotten to the point of full equity. And so what do I say to people when they say, oh, but this was so long ago? I'll say, we had 400 years of affirmative action for white people. So having a very short period of time where some things were being tried in order to make some amends and create some level of equity, it hasn't been enough, clearly.
I just love everything that Shelley says in that comment. It's kind of hard to add to it, but I will say that she uses the word tools, that she didn't have the tools. And I think that in itself is why we have to teach the correct, factual, accurate history of America to give you the tools to navigate today.
Right. What we were talking about earlier, right? With giving people the tools to be able to connect with one another and be able to understand one another, so that we aren't further creating a dynamic of us versus them, right? And it's us together, right, to go forward. I think she does a great job of really kind of summarizing everything that we have been talking about today, right?
Yes, definitely.
And I think she adds kind of that interesting component too of family dynamics and how a family dynamic can play into a person's desire or lack thereof to be educated or to have those hard conversations.
Or to maybe change your perspective on things.
Right, or to change your perspective on things, because to speak to that very first speaker who is talking about groups and the importance of groups, your family is your first group. Your family is the first experience that we have with a group, right? And how much of an influence that can make on us, right? Because we rely on family for, whether that be biological family or chosen family, or family that was, for some people, unfortunately or fortunately, picked for them by some other entity. But we are so reliant on a family, especially in our childhood, right, to meet our needs, right? And we, in both our physical needs and our emotional needs and our social needs, which makes that group in particular so much more challenging to challenge and break out of, and to have those hard conversations, because the bond with that group specifically, just by its nature, is so much more complex and so much deeper. And so I think that she makes a really, really good point that as people who start to navigate in the world, like she said, right, I've made it my own personal mission to learn about these things. And she took it a step further to say, and I want to educate my family. For some people, that is very, very, very challenging. But what better place to start than at home?
Yes, I've tried.
I think you and I both have tried, and some families are going to be more receptive to it. Some families are not going to be as receptive, and so obviously everyone has to.
You don't bring these things up at Thanksgiving dinner,
right? And everyone has to make that determination for themselves about
Yep.
what level of effort is appropriate and safe to do for
Yes.
themselves. And it may be for some people they try and it doesn't work, and okay, this is a conversation I'm willing to sacrifice for the sake of maintaining this family unit, and for some people it is not, and they make the decision to cut ties or do whatever they need to do to be their most authentic self, and But I think that's so unique to each individual
Yeah, oh, for sure,
person.
for sure.
And
There-
their family system.
It's not a one-size-fits-all,
No,
that's for sure.
very few things are. We're
True.
humans. We've got a lot going on.
All right, we're back with Paula.
For as long as this country has had this faction that we've spent most of our time talking about, it's also had this other faction constantly trying to wage for its soul in the other direction, right? So that it actually lives up to its ideals of equality, of due process under the law. I mean, it's really bizarre. It sets up these ideals and then in practice does pretty terribly at meeting them. And yet there's been these incredible radical factions, right? Radical in terms of trying to keep uprooting the nation, right? To actually shift more and more towards that, what Martin Luther King would call that long arch of history towards justice, right? And it's that kind of person that reminded me, oh my gosh, there is this possibility here too, right? Of a kind of Christianity that actually reckons with its past and is willing to self-examine, and as white Americans, right, are looking to look at the legacy of the convergence between Christianity and white supremacy and really think through, what does that mean? What do we owe as a result of that? Not just economic reparations, but the spiritual dimension of the kind of transformation we would have to go through in order to change the system of exploitation and denigration that we've relied on for hundreds of years. I mean, that kind of self-examination, although you see it rarely, exists as a kind of undercurrent as well. And, it's the thing that I try to focus on to kind of keep me going during these times, because if I didn't, well, that and cross-racial alliances and, this incredible ongoing presence, right, of Black people's movements, of Latino people's movements, of all of these different marginalized groups that have done so much to try to pull us towards that other aspect of the soul, like the restoration of the soul, as I call it, in the sense of like the American ideals that we supposedly are supposed to live up to.
Paula speaks of redemption that America's had and can have in the future. How significant would it be if in 2024 we elected a woman of color in Kamala Harris as president?
I think with the space that we're in, and speaking to what I was talking about earlier, right, about Trump really creating a platform and a community for people who were allowed to be outwardly racist and misogynistic, specifically, what an awesome opportunity to be able to show people that in spite of that increased rhetoric, that a Black woman could be president. That despite the last, I'm going to say 8 years of increased racism and misogyny, that we as a country were able to come together to do what we needed to do.
That would be a change
to
in
move
direction.
forward.
Yes,
Yeah,
to move forward.
right. To move forward, and she kind of touched on what I was saying before of like that hope. Like we've done it again, or we've done it in the past. We can do it again, and hopefully somebody who is at least a representation of a larger group that's never really been represented so publicly, can instill more hope in that group as well.
I can't wait for it to happen.
I know, how cool to live in a time where a woman is even being considered for being, like, truly considered, right? I know Hillary Clinton has ran in the past, and unfortunately that has played out the way that it played out, but having a candidate that people are excited for, I think that's the other thing that's really exciting, is having a female candidate that people are excited about and excited for, and has kind of reinvigorated this political race, right? That I think it's the first time I know for myself in a very long time that I have felt hopeful about this country. I mean, you and I were just talking in July, and I was very, very bleak, right? Like, I remember the space that I was in and being like, this feels hopeless. This feels...
Because it was.
Right, it feels hopeless.
100%.
And because it feels hopeless, it feels scary, and it feels defeating. And being in this space now is like, okay, like, this feels good. This is exciting. So I think that is something that a lot of people have not experienced in the last few years or the last few election cycles of being able to be excited. And I think that is a really good place for our country to be.
Well,
excited and hopeful about the future.
For those of us that were around and voting in 2008, it's kind of the same vibe.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think it was a very similar energy and a very similar space. We're in 2024, that was almost 20 years ago. And so to go nearly 20 years without that type of hope is a very long time. It's too long for a country to have to go through.
Next up is racial justice educator and activist Debbie Irving. She's the author of Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race.
Societies have always had myths. I don't think myths in themselves are bad. And when you think about the idea of white superiority, I can tell you firsthand, I think I achieved more in life because of the confidence that came with that idea. I just think everyone should believe that they have the potential to be fantastic people. So I don't have a problem with feeling great about myself and having myths around me that remind me of the nobility that comes with being a human being and the potential in every human being. It's the fact that it's not every. It's the fact that, like every other resource, it's doled out to some people. And if I'm here saying, I've been able to achieve more in life because I was told I was special, what does the opposite of that look like? What's it like to be told everywhere you look that you're flawed? That's not, I don't want to live in that world.
Hearing Debbie talk about that, what popped in my head is that, America's tagline should be a nation of immigrants. And I know we say that in certain spaces, but just, imagine being a third grader and your first crack at American history, and that's the title of the book, America, a Nation of Immigrants, and to celebrate that.
Right, to celebrate.
And therefore, you're taking the whiteness basically out of the equation.
Well, and I think,
obviously you're going to talk about European whites that settle here, of course you are, but you're going to talk about everybody else as well.
But they should.
It shouldn't be like
the difference is right. Everyone would be equally celebrated.
Yes.
Everyone would be equally talked about. All cultures would be receiving
celebrated.
equal attention and equal celebration. Absolutely. Like I think that would be so helpful in combating racism in our country.
And it's the God's honest truth. America.
It's our country, right? It's our country's true American history. And it is so fascinating to me that we are in this space even still today. I mean, I obviously have not been in a history class in
a while.
So I don't know exactly what is being taught present day. But I know for myself it was a very whitewashed version of history, for lack of a better term. But yeah, I think it would be so awesome and so beautiful to be able to give all of our cultures and all of our backgrounds equal celebration and equal education and attention.
We'll hear again from Dr. James Sacita.
The truth forces us to self-reflect on our failures. It forces us to say we were brutes. We want heroes, not brutes. The brutes are other people. And that's not unique to America. No one wants to admit the depth of hurt and harm that our ideas and policies have caused. And one of my challenges in the work that I do is one of equanimity, of trying to balance the burden of these issues. It is not about an anti-Americanism. That's another way of not dealing with the issue. It's about balancing the fact that white people, for lack of a better term, also started the abolitionist movement. also start, that the social justice movements were being challenged by the very people that were viewed as oppressors, by giving voice to the complexity of the issue, and that there were competing issues. Should women get the right to vote? Should we end slavery? We can't do them both. And then there were divisions within even social justice movements, or the chauvinism within the civil rights movement, where women were never given credit. I mean, it's in all of us, no matter. And I think that's a positive thing in that it's not about one group who failed in these ways. It's about the human being who fails in these ways. And we fail no matter our background. We fail no matter our background. It's deeper. It's about looking at humanity. And it's painful. Yeah, one of the films I show is called The Shadow of Hate. The students can barely handle it. It's a review of American history from that reality. And then I take the next two class meetings to visit it so that it's not overpowering in its darkness, but it's important for them to have a dose of the counter narrative. It is intense. I need them to be uncomfortable. I'm not going to leave them there. That's not that, but it's shocking to them, and it would be shocking to anyone.
What comes to mind listening to James there? What jumps out at you?
I think it's really interesting when he talks about the documentary he shows to his students and them being uncomfortable, right? And him also really kind of taking steps, right? Well, it's supposed to make you feel uncomfortable, and I'm not going to leave them in that space. And it's just so interesting that, right, this group of students witnessing that in a very brief and very controlled setting results in that level of response when that has been people's experience living in this country, right? That was the lives of Black people, right? The examples that were provided in this little clip, right? That was the lives for Japanese Americans, right? Like, they lived that. People were living that. And it is appalling. It's absolutely appalling. But yet that's what people were living, right? That's what people's experiences were. And people continue to have to deal with racism, and even if it's not blatant and outwardly, right, we still experience microaggressions all the time. And so I think that's the part that is most interesting to me, is the level of shock that he describes these students having after watching this documentary, when this was people's lives.
In our history. Not to beat a dead horse, but I just think that illustrates the point. Like, if you don't teach the history, then this is what you end up with.
Right. You have a room full of adults that are appalled by the life experiences of other citizens of this country. And that, in and of itself, should be enough for people to do everything that they can not to go back there. And to educate. Like, yes, this is what can happen. Those little statements, those little microaggressions that people tend to think are harmless aren't. And they have deep roots in some atrocities that have been committed against people in this country.
Well, here in election season of 2024, we have Donald Trump and the Republican platform wanting to round up 15 million immigrants and send them back. Do you see any correlation between that and the Japanese internment, like corralling Japanese Americans? And
yes, of course. Right? It has its roots in the same ideologies, right? Us versus them, fear-mongering, false stereotypes, and very limited conversation around it. In the separation, right? We're going to separate people from their families, from their communities, and under the guise of the betterment for the country.
It's ridiculous.
I agree.
It's just so insane.
I agree.
They're here. Let's give them a pathway to be citizens.
Right.
They can pay their taxes. They can, and they're probably already paying taxes. And, but it's like, what do you? That's insane.
Right. Like
It costs. It's going to
let's
just
support
from
people.
ethically, morally, we should support them. But just from a practical financial thing, that's insane. It's like building the wall. It's just impractical.
Right. Right.
And it is fear mongering at the basic level.
Right. And I think it speaks to a larger issue of, right, like how can we support people, right? And we are not a country that has the infrastructure for helping the people that live here
True.
as it is now. And so I think that's where some of that fear mongering kind of comes in, right? Of, well, we're trying to take care of our people, but again, it doesn't have to be either or. And why are we dividing for people that are living here? Like, don't we want people that are living in our country to be healthy and safe? Like, why would we not want that? And why would we not want to provide people the resources to have that? And to have their version of the quote-unquote American dream. Again, this country was built on immigration. How can we support people?
And I mean, the name of this documentary is "What Would Jesus Do on Election Day?" And I believe Jesus said, "Welcome the stranger, take care of them."
Right. Which speaks to really kind of this larger conversation that we're having, right, around acceptance and community and connection and support that is preached in the Bible, right? It's written out there. It's laid out there that this is what Jesus would have done.
And I think he would say, well, they're all God's children. So,
Right.
do you want to consider yourself a Christian nation, or don't you?
Well, separation of church and state. Come on.
I know, but that's yeah.
All right, we end this episode with one last comment from Associate Professor Paula Ionide.
Here, what we have to think about is what kind of person actually is willing to receive knowledge? What kind of person is willing to actually be willing to integrate that knowledge? And what would that do to who they think that they are? So if all of a sudden I actually accept the fact that, not just on my merit alone, but because the United States has a history of, sort of giving white advantages through actual policies. For example, the FHA gave mortgage loans from the 1930s to the 1960s, right? 98% of those FHA loans went to whites and not to people of color, giving them an advantage in homeownership and therefore wealth accumulation. But if I think, I earned that on my own, right? And I'm not willing to let go of that belief because I'm not willing to integrate the fact that I actually received a federally subsidized advantage, what does that say about who I am? Well, first of all, it says, I'm not willing to integrate this information because that information is requiring me to change the worldview of who I am and how I think I got to where I am and who I think is subordinate to me, right? Because supposedly they didn't work hard enough and they didn't do what my grandparents did, which is sort of pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So conservative ideology depends on feelings much more than facts. And what they've been extremely successful at, in contrast to the left, who has been actually highly unsuccessful at this, I would say, is to shape public feelings around a set of false beliefs that actually work as if they are true in people's minds. And then no matter how much you sort of say, but the sociological facts actually say this, it doesn't matter because that belief has become really central to that person's sense of who they are. And they're not willing to let go of it. It's a structure that works much more on an emotional level than it does on a rational level.
What do you think about that concept that she's referring to, that Republicans have been much more successful creating feelings versus facts?
I would agree with that. I mean, time and time again, right? We watch Trump speak about the things that he speaks about and elicits a strong response, more often than not fear or anger or disgust. And when the left responds with, hey, whoa,
Here are the facts.
Here are the facts. people aren't as receptive to it because emotion is so much stronger than logic. That's just facts, right? I mean,
That's human nature.
that's human nature. That's how our bodies and our brains are designed, is for emotion to be so powerful. And so when you have a platform that is entirely based on eliciting emotional responses, it doesn't matter what kind of logic is presented, because the entire platform is based off of emotion, which again is so much stronger than fact. And it's a lot easier to, in an emotional state, well, a couple of things happen, right? When we're highly emotional, our ability to critically think and to process through information is significantly reduced. And so when people are already in a heightened emotional state and facts are presented, they're less likely to even hear them and to understand them, and are more likely to be combative to that and meet logic with emotion. And so I do think that the left, right, tries to be factual and tries to meet that emotion with fact, which I think at this point in time is working. I think people are tired of the emotional rhetoric that's coming from the Republican Party, and that emotional, right, because we can only tolerate so much emotional elevation and so much emotional up and down. And at a certain point, our bodies just don't have the same level of heightened emotional response to the same type of stimulus, whether it be because repeated exposure or just emotional exhaustion. And so I think that is, we're seeing a little bit of that in the Republican Party at this point in time too, right? That, like we were talking about earlier, right? People are tired, like
Enough.
right, and the Republican Party included, where a lot of these politicians are able to set that emotion aside and try to start presenting logic and fact to people who are in a better space to hear it as well. And they're more likely to hear it from somebody that they...
In their own group.
Than they are from a group they identify as being the other, so the left or the Democratic Party. So I do think that there's a lot of truth in that. And I think that we are seeing a bit of a shift in how people are responding to both of those strategies at this point in time.
I'll end with this, and you can comment on it. But I've always thought that the Democrats have an uphill battle, because they're a party of hope, and the Republicans have based their ethos on a party of fear, and it's just easier to do fear.
Right.
And this is, that's just fact.
Right, it's a lot easier to scare a person than it is to instill hope
Inspire
into
them.
Right, inspire them. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think that in a lot of ways the Democratic Party is also fighting an uphill battle, in the sense that they are having to speak out against a lot of systemic problems that this country has been built on.
Very complex problems.
Right. And they're having to do it in a way, because as much as the Republican Party relies on emotion, if the Democratic Party shows that same level, they use that against them, right? How can we possibly trust the Democratic Party to lead us and guide us? Look at how irrational and emotional they're being when they talk about, LGBTQ rights. Look how, irrational they are when they're talking about women's health issues, right? Like the level of emotion, right, which reasonably so, there should be some anger, there should be some fear, there should be, some big emotions, because those are things that are, right?
Very important.
Very important in impacting people's lives. But the Republican Party historically has been able to take that emotion and use it against the Democratic Party, which is, I think, partially why we see this increased focus on fact and logic from the Democratic Party than we do with...
Well, the fact that data has become such a big thing in every phase of our lives, whether it be work or you name it. The Democratic Party has latched onto that because it explains a lot of things,
Right.
and it shows you, well, this is what is actually happening.
Right.
So I agree with you. It's like that whole fact, data driven,
Right.
making policy based on real data versus assumptions.
Right. Or feelings.
Yeah, or feelings.
Right.
Because there's a lot of things, if you go back in time, that Democrats would change policy-wise that did not work. And a lot of that would be, now you have the data to show, we don't need to do that because we have the data that shows, actually, this is what happens when you do this thing.
Right. These were the outcomes of that and the information to back that up.
Well, thank you for contributing your time and your thoughts and your expertise. It's been great chatting with you, and maybe we'll start a new podcast after election called Life After Trump or America After Trump, because it's going to be extremely interesting to see what happens.
I think it's going to be so interesting
Republican
to
Party.
see. Well, and I think even beyond just the Republican Party, I think our country as a whole, I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see what shifts and what directions we go after this election. So thank you for having me. I hope I did not do your very educated and eloquent and concise and articulate and very inspiring documentary speakers any disservice, because they have a lot of really beautiful points and a lot of things that really, I think, resonated with me, and I'm sure will resonate with other people as well. So.
Thanks for the kind words.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
All right, that wraps up the director's cut of episode 6. I'd like to thank Kelsey for taking the time today and contributing her thoughts and expertise to this podcast. I hope you'll listen to the next and final episode 7, The Way Forward with Vote Common Good. Thank you and take care.